Hi there! Welcome to the how-to video about how to use the Reedual machine from Precision Reed Products. One of the first things that you need to do when you already purchased a reed machine is set up a reed making space, whether you can set up a permanent one or whether it's your kitchen table like mine used to be and you'd have to put things away when you're done, put things back out, that's fine. But what you want to have is a space where you can use your reed machine, a light so that you can see what you're doing. I have the vacuum cleaner attached to the back of the table with C-clamps, but they do on the website you can buy an attachment that helps you hold the vacuum cleaner right onto the reed machine. Either way works for me. I have a couple different weights of sandpaper. I have 220 and 400 glued to a piece of glass so that it stays super flat, so that when you're sanding the back of the reeds you can really make sure that it's not warped and there's no weird little bumps or ditches in it. And you need a few specific tools. You need something to soak water in, a teeny little short-handled flat screwdriver. You need a reed clipper that corresponds with whichever reed size you're making. We'll be making a B-flat clarinet reed today, so I have a B-flat clarinet reed clipper. And then eventually, once you're doing the fine-tuning on the reeds, you should use a reed knife and a plaque to keep things flat, but that's after you've made a reed on the machine. So we're gonna start with some pre-made blanks. As I said, today we're going to be demonstrating a B-flat clarinet reed, but the Reedual is set up so that you can make anything within the clarinet or the saxophone family. You can go as small as an E-flat clarinet, you can go as big as a baritone saxophone reed. It just depends on how you want to use it and what numbers you set things to. But today it will be a B-flat clarinet reed. So to introduce you to the different parts of the machine, it should come set up for whatever size reed you are making. So this one has a piece of plastic that's taped on, and it's hard to see, but it's taped on up to the number 1 line right here because I use it for B-flat and E-flat clarinet reeds. If I were going to be using it for bigger reeds, it would slide up to different numbers corresponding on either side. There is no piece of plastic over here. It's just on this side to protect the table from the sandpaper. Here is the motor, and you also have the belt that attaches the motor to the sanding drum. So when you're ready to go, you loop it around the top of that and the top of the sanding drum, and then the two are attached so the motor will actually spin the sanding drum. Mine came with a piece of sandpaper attached to it, but you will eventually have to change them. So what I use is the Norton Pro Sand 220 sandpaper, but if you use different pieces of sandpaper, you will have to change the harder, softer resistance knob over here, which we'll talk about in a second. But when it comes time to change it, to put it on, the easiest thing to do is to fold down the sides just a little bit, because then they will fit evenly into this little notch. And your machine will also have come with a little piece of leather shoelace, and they do eventually wear out once you've change the sandpaper often, so you can just get another pair of leather shoelaces and cut a little piece off. This is where the short-handled screwdriver comes in handy. I use that to make sure that the shoelace fits in there nice and snug. You want it in the notch and not sticking out from this, because this part is going to touch the reed, so you want this in so that it doesn't do anything strange while you're cutting. There we go, that's better. All right, again, this is the resistance knob on the back. It says harder on one side and softer on the other, and there's a dot in the middle. That's a good guide to start if you start with the dot in the middle. It takes a little trial and error to find out what the resistance is right for you, but try making a few there, and then based on how they come off, if they're come off a little too hard to play or a little too soft, you can switch it one way or the other. It doesn't take a lot to turn it. You don't have to do a whole giant twist. The little lines here are just enough to move it harder or softer if you want to. All right, so one of the first things that you have to do is pick a model reed. A model reed is something that at one point was very good, that you played and really liked. It wasn't too hard, it wasn't too soft, it had a nice vibrancy, it was balanced nicely, so you want a reed that did actually play very well at one point, but is maybe just getting a little bit tired and you're about ready to retire it, and then you can retire it to be your reed machine model reed. So the model reed, you want to make sure it's not got any dust on the back so it sits flat, goes on the right side of the cutting table here. And you line it up according to the size reed you're making, because we're making B-flat reeds, B-flat clarinet reeds. You line up the tip at the number 1 here, and you want to make sure that it's also centered between the two horizontal lines. And then this little metal strap keeps it in place. So you tighten it down so that it doesn't wiggle around. You see it's in there pretty well. The purpose of putting the model reed over here is once it's attached and you flip the cutting arm up into position, it touches against this that basically traces it. So what you're going to do eventually is make smooth stripes down so that this follows the contours of your model reed and transfers it over here to the blank on this side. So as you're basically teaching the machine, this is the shape of the reed on this side. And this, you can start there and go a little bit further, and you can start in the center so that you're cutting away everything on the blank that doesn't match the model reed on this side. Then we have some reed blanks that are already made and they're cured. I go through a curing process that takes about a week of drying them, soaking them and drying them and soaking them and drying them. So hopefully the worst of the warping is over before you ever make it into a reed. It still will do a little bit of that once it's made into a reed and you're playing it, but the worst of it should be done as a blank before it's ever actually made into a reed. So the first thing we do, we're going to use our sandpaper over here. This is an older version of the Norton 220 and this is Norton 400, so it's a little bit finer. And the first thing we have to do is sand the back so that it's perfectly flat and shiny. So to do that, the best thing to do is to put 3 fingers across the top of the reed. If you just used one, you would get a lot of pressure in the middle, but not as much on the ends. And if you just kind of held it here, it's not all that steady, plus you'd end up sanding the tips of your fingers anyway. But if you use even pressure across the entire top of the reed, it should sand it evenly and make it nice and flat on the back. So what you want to look for, if you hold it up to a light and you look at it at an angle, the entire back of the reed should be reflective and shiny and there shouldn't be any dull spots in it. Usually if there's a dull spot, and this one has one, it's up in the corner. So I'm going to keep sanding it a little bit further because there's one little spot that just looks, it's not reflecting the light as much as the rest of it does. It's not super shiny. And it's hard to keep these from slipping. There we go. There we go. And now you can use the finer sandpaper, the 400 grit, to polish it just a little bit more. And then we want to check and make sure that now it's nice and shiny and reflective. We want to check and make sure it's actually flat. So I'm going to put it flat on a piece of glass, not the table, because the table's not a reliably flat surface, but the glass is. So I'm going to push alternately on one side and the other to see if it rocks back and forth at all, and it doesn't. And then I'm going to do over the other side from the tip to the heel, and it does wiggle just a little bit. And you have to make sure that you're actually checking to see if it's rocking and it's not just accidentally scooting back and forth on the glass. But this one is tipping just a little bit, which means there's something about it that's a little bit warped. It's not totally flat yet. So we're going to do this again. Because if it doesn't sit completely flat on the table of your mouthpiece, it's not going to vibrate the way you want it to. All right. Good. Now I don't see it tipping either this way or that way. It seems to be perfectly flat. If you want to, the very last thing you can do is use the back of a piece of sandpaper and do the same thing just to seal it a little bit and make it super shiny and flat. But make sure there's nothing underneath the sandpaper, between the sandpaper and the glass, because you don't want to add in weird little bumps that you just work so hard to try to get out. All right, so now we're ready to put this blank onto the machine. So before I lined up the model reed with the number 1 line because I'm making that size reeds. So when I put the blank over here, I'm also going to line it up with the number 1 line and make sure that it's centered between the 2 horizontal stripes on the cutting table. And just like I did with the model reed, you tighten it down so that it doesn't go anywhere while you're cutting it. Now, you have to decide how long you're going to cut the vamp, and that depends on how big the table or the window of your mouthpiece is. The kind of reed that I play, the kind of mouthpiece that I play, the window needs to be about 1.25 inches, and I actually have a line written on my reed machine right there to tell me where it is. But you can measure the window on your mouthpiece to decide how long the vamp has to be, because it will be different with different models, and of course it's different with different size instruments. I also like to draw a line on the blank starting on this side and across so that it's really easy to see while I'm cutting. I don't have to guess where it's supposed to be. So now we're ready to make the first cut on the machine. And the first cut is just about taking off all of this extra material up here. It's not about fine tuning, it's not about the little balancing things. We're just trying to take away everything that's not a reed. So what I'm going to do when I turn the machine on is I'm going to start at the tip, or what would be the tip of the reed, and I'm going to rock it gently back and forth and let the machine just take off all the extra material. This is why we run a vacuum cleaner while we're making it, so it can suck up all the sawdust that's going to come off. And I will just slowly move it down until I get to the vamp, and again, just get most of the material off. Once I've done that once, I'll start from the vamp and go to the tip in stripes to try to get all of the rest of the bumps and all of the super extra material off. So this will be the first cut of 2. So if you're watching, you'll see that I was holding the cutting table with my right hand. I did have my left index finger on the end of the table, but it was just to keep the machine from pulling it too quickly. This blank is particularly thick, and sometimes the machine will sort of grab the material and want to pull it past where you actually want the vamp to end. So if you do use any of your left hand at all, which you don't even have to, and you probably shouldn't, you can only just use one finger just to keep the arm from moving way too far. But all I was doing with my left hand was moving it back and forth and slowly sliding it down. So at this point, most of the material is off. It's still going to be a pretty thick blank, but most of the material is off on the first cut. And it does sort of resemble a reed. But now we need to get rid of those crazy square corners. So that's where the reed clipper comes in handy. And we will trim the tip so that it actually looks like a clarinet reed now. And you don't want to just cut the corners off, you want to cut it far enough that you are actually trimming a little bit off the tip as well, so that it's nice and curved and even. Now, I'm going to soak that in the water, because after the first cut, you should try play testing it just a little bit. Often, it's going to be really hard, but we've only cut it once, we are going to cut it a second time. So don't worry if after the first cut it's still really too hard to play. If after the first cut it's really easy to play and it seems really vibrant and responsive, just throw it away. That reed will never make you happy. If it's that thin after the first cut and doesn't need a second one, it means that the cane is rubbery and is probably not ever gonna make you happy. So after soaking it for 20 or 30 seconds in just water, there's nothing special in there, we're gonna play it and see what happens, if anything. So you can see it's way too hard, but as everybody knows, once you've put a piece of cane into water, the wood is going to soak it up and it's going to expand a little bit, which is why we do a second cut, to take off the extra material that's there after you put in water and it's expanded. So the second cut is about doing much more of the fine tuning and getting things down to be the actual correct strength and resistance of the reed that you want. So I'm sliding it back on, lining it up with the number 1 again, and making sure it's exactly halfway between and centered between those two horizontal lines. The second cut you can also do with commercial made reeds that you're just trying to make a little bit softer, if they're a little bit too hard. But you only ever want to put reeds on the machine after you've soaked them and play tested them. If you put a completely dry reed on the machine, the tip is likely to be a little bit warped or tipped a little bit up, and the machine will take off all of that stuff that's sticking up and probably strip the tip off of your reed. So regardless of whether you're making homemade reeds or you're working on commercial made reeds, the second cut should always be done after you've soaked the reed in water. So now what we're going to do, and actually I put this up a little too far. For the second cut, we are not going to start at the tip and work our way down the vamp. We're going to start at the bottom of the vamp and always work in stripes towards the tip. So what I'm going to do, and I'll show you without all of the equipment running so you can actually hear me talking. I will always start at the vamp, and then gently with my right hand, I will just pull it towards the tip. Now, when you do that, even if you start at one corner, if you have it tipped to try to work on this corner first, you should always let it fall back to center about halfway up the vamp. If you leave it tipped all the way so that the sandpaper is always just working on this side, it's going to completely take off the material on this corner. It's either going to take it down so far it's going to be about as thick as tissue paper, or it's going to take it completely off. So we're going to work on stripes. Like I said, I'm going to start at the tip and just go straight down, or I'm going to start at the side, but I'm going to let it go back to center, so it'll make sort of a swooping shape. I'll start here and make sure it goes back to center. I'll start here and make sure it goes back to center. I'll start there and make sure it goes back to center, so that I'm always going from about here down. I'm always going straight on so that it doesn't take any material too far off of one side of the tip or the other. So here's the second cut, always starting from the vamp and working down to the tip. Once you've done a number of stripes down the length of the reed, it should have taken off all the material that's left to be taken off. And you can always double check to make sure that things are smooth by looking at it at an angle, just the way we did with the back. If you look at it at this angle, you'll be able to see if there are any sort of bumps or ridges of parts of the vamp that you've missed. And you can always put them back on the machine and even them out. So we're going to soak this in water just again for a couple of seconds. It doesn't have to be even as long as the first time. and see how this reed turned out. It's a completely playable reed. Now, after you take it off the machine, you will need to do some fine-tuning by hand just to make sure things are completely balanced, because there are imperfections that grow into the cane, because we are dealing with a living plant here. But a reed should be playable off the machine. If it's too hard or too soft, then you need to check your settings on the resistance knob and try something a little bit different, whether it's too hard or too soft. But when it comes off the machine, you should be able to at least make a sound with it. And then the fine tuning to get that extra vibrancy and balance in it can be done by hand. So I hope this helps. Thanks for watching, and enjoy making your own reeds.